we at Brightbeam have set out to tell the story of how white women as mothers and as teachers have historically used their positions of power to perpetuate systems of oppression, and how that history remains alive and active today. Part of that story celebrates the outliers in history, the white women who have acted as accomplices, who bucked that system and worked to provide a just education to Black and brown young people. Also to build empathy in white children so that we might build a better future together, sometimes at significant personal cost. You, Jane, clearly are one of the accomplices. So I'd like to take you back to that day in April 1968, when you first walked into that classroom and began your famous brown eyes, blue eyes experiment with your third grade class. We know that white women dominate the teaching profession. And we also know that as a rule, many of the white women in our schools continue to do harm, and they're not standing up and speaking out against the racism and the inequality that's happening in classrooms today.
And I'll tell you why, wait a minute, I'll tell you why they don't speak out.
Okay.
They want to keep their jobs.
Exactly.
And it's more dangerous now to stand up and say, look, we're all one race in this classroom, and we're all going to treat one another like members of the same race. You are all my 30th to 50th cousins. Now, if your parents don't appreciate that, that's their problem. But in this room, this is the way you're going to be treated. Every person in this room is going to be treated. We are going to use the 3 R's in this room. And that's not reading, writing, and arithmetic, since only one of those words begins with R. So boys and girls, in this classroom, we're going to learn the 3 R's of rights, respect, and responsibility. I am going to hold you responsible for respecting the rights of every person in this building, not just in the building, but on the playground, on the bus, on the street when you see them, downtown when you go to see Santa Claus and get in line. Observe rights, respect, and responsibility in your communications with other people in the future. After you leave this classroom, if I see you on the street and I see you not respecting somebody else's rights, I will step up and say, didn't you learn enough in third grade? How would you like to come back and repeat the class? Because obviously you forgot what I tried to teach you. It's time for us to start teaching the truth instead of the lie. There's only one race of people on the face of the earth. There are lots of different color groups, lots of different national groups, lots of different gender groups and sexual orientation groups, but they're all members of the same damned race. And if we don't stop what we're doing, we are going to be damned because of our desire to promote the idea of a white race. Kids have to know, and adults have to know, that only from 15 to 18% of the human beings living on the face of the earth are classified as white. Did you know that?
I'll tell you, the only reason I know that is because I've watched your interviews.
Okay, so I'm repeating myself. And people say to me, I've heard it before, I've heard it before, I've heard it before. But if you have an object or something to sell, if you have a product to sell, the people that watch the television or whoever they're advertising it have to hear that advertisement list at least 4 times before they'll buy the product. So I will say at least 1,000 times before, no, more than that before I die, because I expect to live for another 10 years, and that's a threat, I know, but that's the way it's going to be, because I'm not going to die until we have gotten over the idea of more than one race. I'm going to say that over and over and over until people get it into their heads that that's the truth. And I'm a Christian, so I believe ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set ye free. Now, I wouldn't be a Christian if it hadn't been for Jews. People who are marching against, who are saying Jews will not replace us. These silly Proud Boys, what they have forgotten is there wouldn't be Christians or Muslims or Baha'is if it weren't for the Jewish people. The first 5 books of the Bible, of the Old Testament, came out of the Torah. Evidently, these ignorant people don't know that. But you see, you're talking about education. I'm an educator. We have these kids all day, every day, for at least 8 hours a day, 6 to 8 hours a day, for 180 days of the year. And nobody tells them, look, boys and girls, the only reason there are white people is because black people came here first. And they faded as they moved farther and farther north from the equator. Their melanin faded so that their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. Their brains didn't get smaller, but their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. That's the only reason you children can call yourselves white. And you aren't white. We are all shades of brown. A couple of young women called me a couple of years ago and said, Miss Elliott, yeah, from now on, when we have to fill in a form that says, what is our race, we're going to put human. I said, that's a good idea. What are you going to put if it says skin color? One of them said, I'm going to put mocha. The other one said, I'm going to put chocolate. They were absolutely right. Those are the colors of their skin. This isn't white. People get rid of this idea of whiteness. This is white. This is not white. The whole thing is so childish. It isn't even adolescent. It's kindergartner. It's time for us to get over the idea of black and white. Those two words were used for the first time to describe skin color during the Spanish Inquisition in the late 1400s, early 1500s. Before that, people were just people. We were all members of the family of man. But then Torquemada and company wanted to change a whole bunch of people into Catholics. So he went around killing those that he thought didn't look like they would be Christians. He found out he'd killed a bunch of Christians, and then he realized you can't tell what a person's religion is by looking at them. So he had to find another way to determine who might deserve to die. So he set upon skin color. He called the lighter people white and the darker people black. None of them were white or black. They were all shades of brown. And we have been doing this for about 440 years. Do you think that's long enough?
You've been doing this such a long time. So I'm sure like that answer has been so developed and so well thought out. And it's something people need to hear. And I think back to that day that you walked in the classroom and how the times have changed. I was a history teacher for a long time. And I think about just the context of the 1960s. And I think about the context of today. And today we spend a lot of time talking about, social justice. And we spend a lot of time talking about equity. And people are focused on those concepts today. And it's something that we're used to hearing about. We're hearing it in the news. We're hearing it, in regular everyday conversation. It's not something we talked about a lot before Martin Luther King. And it was something that was volatile in that period, clearly, with assassinations happening. You'd think it would be easier, even though jobs are threatened, you'd think it would be easier for the white women to talk about this today, to stand up and speak out, than it would have been for you to do that in that time. What was it that day that motivated you, where you said, I have to do this lesson, that you weren't afraid to walk in there and do that lesson that day because it was important? What was it that motivated you, that moved you to do that in spite of what could have happened?
Number one, ignorance. I didn't realize that even though my family was well thought of in that community, and my great-grandfather was one of the first settlers in that community, it hadn't occurred to me that we were only well thought of as long as we went along to get along. My mother was a Catholic, and my father was a Baptist. So we had the War of the Roses in our house all day, every day. They didn't fight up front about religion, but they fought because of their religion. But they didn't say religion, but they fought in a way that was perfectly obvious to me that the basis of their disagreement was the way they were raised. And my father was raised in a believing Baptist home, and my mother was raised in a casual Catholic home. So both of them, my mother was disowned by her family because she married outside the church. And my father's mother couldn't stand my mother because she was in the church. So here we were. We were very isolated. That little family was very isolated because my parents had done the wrong thing. Turns out that my father did what was wrong for him, but raised us in a way that was right for us, because he said to us every week, you know the difference between right and wrong. Now do the right thing, goddammit. I lived in Waterloo, Iowa for a number of years, and my husband worked for National Tea Food Store, and they were going to transfer him from Waterloo to someplace else. So we owned a house, and we put the house up for rent. Somebody called. This is embarrassing. Somebody called and said, do you rent to coloreds? And I said, this is an all-white community. And I knew exactly and immediately what I had done. I had defected to the enemy, and I had always sworn that I would never go along with racism. But when the chips were down and money was involved, I knew immediately if we rented that to people of color, and when we came back there, nobody would have anything to do with us on the west side of Waterloo. I will never forget that as long as I live, and I will never let it happen to me again. I swore at that moment, if I lose money, if I lose friends, if I lose love, if I lose my family, I will not bow to racism again as long as I live. And I've paid a dear price for deciding that. However, kids all over the world, literally all over the world, are being shown the film The Eye of the Storm of my third graders going through the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. It changes people all over the world when they see those kids, those poor little white kids, suffering for a day, and then apply it to the suffering that happens with children of color in my country, the most supposedly civilized country on the face of the earth, not for a lifetime. If you can't stand to see little children, white children, go through that for a day, then by the gods of war, you better stop insisting that children of color go through it from before they're born until after they're dead. And that's what happens in this country. And you can deny it until hell freezes over. That will not change the fact. There are still cemeteries in this country where black people, what we call black people, are not allowed to be buried because we aren't sure what they're going to do when they get down there. We have churches all over and synagogues, places of worship all over this country where there are pictures of Jesus with light brown, strong, stringy hair, indeterminate eyes, and pale skin. Now, in the Bible, it says he had feet of bronze and kinky, woolly hair. I challenge, if you're ever going to use what I'm saying right now, I wish you'd use it before Christmas, because I challenge somebody to go down to the local manger scene, take out the little Pillsbury Doughboy doll, and put in a black doll. Now put a camera up where you can take pictures of people who come in and see what's in that creche, and they'll say, he's black. And you'll say, that's right, and so was Jesus. How do you like me now? But you see, I think that would be a logical thing to do. And it would be honest and it would be factual. And it's what we need to do. But you see, one of the main differences between us so-called white people and people of color is when white people come into a new environment, they immediately adjust the environment to fit their needs. Yeah, when people of color come into a new environment, they immediately adjust their needs to fit the environment. They learn to live with the land, but we white people learn to change the land so that it's easier for us to live. I understand that. We white people came from northern climates where you couldn't get through the winter without really working to build something to live in and to store food so that you'd have something to eat. I understand that. However, we are now in a situation where most of us have a decent place to live and most of us can heat our homes and most of us have electricity in the wintertime. We can stop adjusting the environment to fit our needs now. And where Jesus is concerned, we better stop adjusting that environment so that it's somebody that we can pray to. I want to see some white folks praying to a black Jesus before I die. Because that's what he was. He was an Ethiopian Jew. Let's get over it.
You had mentioned being, the ignorance was one of the reasons why you walked into the classroom that day. So you had not anticipated any of the backlash that you were going to face?
No, absolutely not. I had never known what it felt to be treated badly because of a physical characteristic over which you have no control. As a female, I know how that feels. As a short person, I know how that feels. And as somebody who tends to get a little heavy when Christmas time comes, by next week I'll be 10 pounds heavier than I am now. But I know how it feels to be treated unfairly on the basis of a physical characteristic over which I have no control. But that is nothing compared to what happens to the child who comes into the classroom for the first time into third grade and the teacher says, oh, here's another little black boy. Now, if that kid goes to the dictionary, which he will in third grade, and looks up the word black, it will say savage and evil. And if he looks up the word white, because the little girl coming behind him is called white, the dictionary will say pure and good. Now, after they've read those two words, they don't go and read the rest of the words about melanin or the lack of it or the presence of melanin. They don't go to that. They simply read those two words that describe white and that describe black. It's time to stop using those two words to describe human beings because human beings do not come in those colors. That day, when I told my students after we had talked about this, we talked about what Martin Luther King Jr. had been one of our heroes of the month. And we talked about him, and those kids were really angry that he was dead. And I said, and we talked about racism. We talked about unfairness. We talked about skin color. We did all the things that white people do when they don't know enough to change the situation. And I finally said, kids, our lesson plan for today is to learn the Sioux Indian prayer that says, "O Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I walked a mile in his moccasins." Would you like to walk in the shoes of a black child for a day in this in this classroom? Well, yeah, that'd be, it was like, we could have fun. We always have fun in this classroom. She comes up with really fun things. I said, now you want to think about this very carefully. Are you sure that you want me to divide you into two groups so that one group is on the top and one group is on the bottom? Yeah. They knew it wasn't going to be true. It was going to end at the end of the day. Let's try that. So I separated them according to the color of their eyes. And since I have blue eyes and most of the students in the room were blue-eyed, I wanted the power not to be in the majority group that day. So the blue-eyed people were on the bottom, the brown-eyed people were on the top. Immediately, when I stood in front of that group and said, okay now, and I put armbands around them so that the people, we could tell what color their eyes are without getting too close to them. They sat there with their armbands on, and all of a sudden, they were a different group of children. I swear to you that they had become a different group of children because now they weren't one group anymore. They were a group of two. They were two groups of children. One who had to move their desks to the back of the room because they were blue-eyed, and blue-eyed people don't learn fast enough anyway. And the other brown-eyed because they got to sit in the front of the room because we know they learn faster and they pay better attention and their desks are always cleaner. And these kids came up with those remarks very, very quickly. I finally said, how do you know these things are true? And they said, because that's the way it is. And I said, I said something, can't remember what it was. And little brown-eyed Debbie sitting in the front row looked up at me and said, how come you're that teacher here if you got them blue eyes? And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And my first thought was, why, you little shit. And that's not the thought I ever had about Debbie before. And then Alan in the back row said, if she didn't have them blue eyes, she'd be the principal or the superintendent. They're both brown-eyed. Now, he didn't know what, he was our Uncle Tom. He didn't know what color the principal and the superintendent's eyes were, but he automatically assumed that they must be brown because they had power. I was absolutely terrified by what I heard those kids do to me and to one another on that first morning. I went down to the teachers. I thought it was bad with the kids. I went down to the teacher's lounge at noon. I needed some support. I went into the teacher's lounge. There were two other third grade teachers in the lounge, along with some of the other teachers. It was noon. They were eating their lunch. And I went in and I started to tell them what was happening in my classroom the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. When I had finished telling them what was going on, the younger of those two third grade teachers, who was probably 50 years old at the time, looked at me and said, I don't know how you have time for all that extra stuff. It's all I can do to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, she hadn't taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. She might as well have done the extra stuff. The other one said, and I'll never forget it as long as I live, she looked up at me, and she was over 60 years old, had been molding young minds in that community for many years. And she said to me, I don't know why you're doing that. I thought it was about time somebody shot that son of a bitch. Nobody gasped. Nobody frowned. Nobody said, how can you say a thing like that? Every one of those so-called educated Christian women either smiled or laughed and nodded because she had expressed their feelings perfectly, and as the most senior member of the group, she had the most right to do so. Nobody on the face of the earth needs to tell me that education, as it is offered in the United States of America today, leads to people seeing one another as deserving equitable treatment under the law. We talk about equality, but we do not furnish it because I'll never be equal to anybody else, but I have the right to being treated equally. And I want it, and I want it now. I'm going to steep. I couldn't believe it. I absolutely couldn't believe it. I went back to my classroom that no child of any age, no person of any age will ever leave my presence with those attitudes unchallenged. That will never happen to me again. And it won't now because no one will speak to me because they're afraid that they're going to say something racist. And I'm going to say, do you know what you just said? You just made another racist remark. every time I do one of these, somebody comes up to me, usually a white female, and says, I don't see color. Oh my God, people. All I have to do is say, what do you do when you come to a stop sign on the stoplight? Well, you know what I mean. I say, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. But you didn't want me to realize that that's exactly what you mean, because you're going to say that that's, well, we have psychologists have names for all these ridiculous behaviors and ridiculous statements. And it's time for us to get over the 3 and 4 and 5 syllable words and say what it is. It's ignorance.
You're 100% right. We were all brought up in a very racist system.
Absolutely.
And we're socialized that way. So even though we all might want to believe that none of that was seeping in along the way, of course it was. We all have behaviors, or we all have habits, or we all have programmed ideas about the world that if we really dig in and investigate them, we can find something in there. And it's work. It's hard work to dig away at those things and peel them away. And you have to be intentional about it. You have to want to think about those things, and you have to want to get rid of them, and you have to want to do the work to do it.
And that's the reason you go to the commitments to combat racism. The first time I did that exercise, the kids went home, told their parents what had gone on. My brother-in-law was up at the restaurant, because that's where they went for coffee every morning. And he said, they said up there, Jane, they're saying up there, why is she teaching about racism in Riceville? We don't have any racism in Riceville. We don't have any N-words. And he told me that. I said, Keith, didn't you tell them that's an indication of racism? He said, Jane, I got to get along with those people. I am in complete control of most situations, because I will not be intimidated by any other human being in the area of racism. You can deny it until hell freezes over. It is part of our upbringing.
So what are some of the other things that you experienced, some of the other backlash that happened that you didn't anticipate?
My parents lost their business. We owned a hotel in Riceville, and my mother ran a restaurant in the hotel. And the day before the exercise, she served 30 dinners, and Riceville's a very small town. The day after I did the exercise and the news got out, she served none. She closed the dining area. My kids were beaten and spit on. Their belongings were destroyed. They were chased. My son was chased home from school by 5 kids, 5 high school boys. He was in junior high. 5 high school boys chased him home from school in their car. 3 got out to beat him up. 1 stayed in the car to watch, and 1 stayed in the car to drive away. When I called their mothers, 2 of whom talked with me and asked them what they wanted to do about what had happened to my son, one of them said, you should have thought of that before you did that exercise. Your kid's getting what you deserve. My children lost all their friends. My parents lost their business. I had friends to begin with. I didn't have friends the day after I did that. I was a member of a bowling team. I was in a card group. The day after I did the weekend after I did the exercise, they found another person to play on the bowling team, and I was not invited to any more card parties. It was very obvious immediately that I had kicked over the crucifix, and I was going to suffer for it. After 2.5, 3 years, the principal's wife, who taught at the high school, stopped me in a teacher's meeting and said, Jane, you've got to get your kids out of this school. I said, why? She said, because these teachers are trying to destroy your children, and they're enjoying it. You better get them out of here. So we moved to Osage, where my husband was running a grocery store. And look at how the parents and the teachers and their peers behaved because of something that happened to one group of 3rd graders every year for 1 day. And then we expect people who go through this at the hands of we good Christians who aren't racist all day long, from before they're born until after they're dead. And we expect them not to be angry, and we expect them to succeed in spite of what we tell them they can't do. We expect them to treat us pleasantly, even though we have treated them anything but pleasantly. We think that we white folks have got it made, but we need to remember, and this is what's terrifying, and this is the reason for the Proud Boys and QAnon and the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers and the KKK. The reason for all those groups is they know that within 30 years, and it'll be less than 30 years now, what we call white people will be a numerical minority in the United States of America, trying to prevent what is inevitable, which is we are going to be outnumbered on this continent as we are all over the world by skin color. Skin color is not an indicator of intelligence or of your worth as a human being.
It's just listening to what happened to your family, especially your kids. And, thinking about, I'm thinking about my days as a teacher. I certainly got in trouble for plenty of lessons and had parents come for me trying to do similar lessons, experiential lessons and make an impact on kids. And never to that degree, even if they were about sensitive topics like race or gender or, things that were happening in society that were just ugly.
Imagine how you would have been treated if you had been a black woman, a teacher,
Right.
doing those things that they found objectionable. They'd have fired you or they'd have killed you.
And I think about, those women that are out there today that we're trying to talk to, that we're trying to speak to and saying, like, this is your fight. Get out there and stand up and speak up. And just thinking about them, why the backlash that they're getting today, like certainly people are going to get a little bit of backlash. They might be ostracized a bit. Some of them may even lose their jobs. It could happen. It has happened. But for many of us, they're not going to have the same kind of backlash that you had. Their families won't lose their businesses. Their children won't be tortured. It's not going to be to the same degree as it may have been in 68, 69, 70. Why are we still stuck? And even beyond teachers, why are people today still not over skin color? Why are we so stuck and we can't move past it?
They are living with self-imposed ignorance. And face it, if you have pale skin, you are guaranteed, practically guaranteed, no matter how dumb you are guaranteed to get a position somewhere. You're going to get a job. You are going to be excused for your mistakes. They're going to blame it on somebody who didn't teach you the right thing. They hired me to work for U.S. West Direct in public service of Colorado. In 1985, I left the classroom and went to work with corporations. Now, I had never worked with a corporation before, but they said, we need you to do the exercise with our employees. I said, you don't like your employees? Well, now, Mrs. Elliott, we think our employees can learn from this. I said, are you willing to put your employees through this? And the woman who hired me was a melanaceous woman and no messing around. She said, this is what we want to do. We're going to change these corporations. After 3 years, the CEO said, this is the best thing that we've ever done with this company. This has changed the way this company behaves. He was in one of the first 3 exercises that I did there. Well, the CEO was one of the blue-eyed people. And he said, I know all this material. I said, I'll bet you don't. Take the test. And I shoved the test at him. He's on the floor and I'm shoving it down at him. So he took the test. And after it was over, we read our scores and he got a low score. And he looked like, how can this be? It didn't occur to him that I could, because of the way I treated him, and because of the way I looked down on him, and because of where I made him sit on the floor so that I could stand over him and shake my finger in his face, it hadn't occurred to him that that kind of treatment could change his ability to think clearly. And that man leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, we will continue to do this exercise for as long as you are ready to do it. I have learned more here today than I have ever learned in a meeting before. You can't criticize people who don't succeed if you have told them before you teach them that they are going to be able to learn. And that's what the principal did to me. The third year I did the exercise. He handed me my class roll before school started. We were at a teacher's meeting. He said, Miss Elliott, these kids are never going to learn to read. No other teacher has ever been able to teach them to read, and neither will you. Just pass them on and get them out of here. They'll never graduate from high school. And I thought, well, I thought really ugly things. I went to the teacher's lounge, to the office, and I looked through their cumulative files. Every one of those 16 students had high math scores, low reading and spelling scores. And I knew immediately what he had given me. He had given me 16 moderately to severely dyslexic students. And the reason their previous teachers hadn't been able to teach them was because they didn't know how to teach the dyslexic child. I had a 3-week course in doing that in Rochester, Minnesota during that summer. And I looked at that class roll and I started to grin. And the teachers all looked at me, what are you grinning about? I said, I've got the greatest opportunity right here in my hand. is the opportunity for me to look like the best teacher in this system. Well, I don't know. I said, I know you don't. But these kids are all going to be reading at the fourth grade level. When they leave my classroom, they will be reading at the fourth grade level. Well, do you think you are Miss Miracle Worker? No. I think I know how to teach the dyslexic child.